Chapter 1. A Thirsty World, Why Pumping Water Was Life or Death. Imagine waking up in a world where every drop of water must obey the same relentless law. It flows downhill, never up. Now imagine that you, your family, your farm, your animals, your entire survival depend on somehow breaking that rule. This was life in the year 1300 AD, long before electricity, engines, or even the simplest mechanical conveniences we take for granted. Water wasn't just part of life, it was life, and for medieval people, it was also one of their most stubborn enemies. In most towns, rivers stayed in the valleys while people lived on the hills. Castles sat high on cliffs for defense, but that meant the water was far below. Farms stretched across uneven terrain, where irrigation wasn't just difficult, it felt impossible. And deep within the earth, miners dug for metals that fueled medieval economies, only to face sudden floods that turned tunnels into drowning traps. In every corner of medieval Europe, one brutal truth shaped daily life. If you couldn't move water, you couldn't survive. Daily life built around water, and its limits. Medieval villagers measured their days by it. At dawn, women walked miles to springs with clay jugs balanced on their hips. Farmers prayed for rain one month and prayed for no rain the next. Children fetched buckets again and again, their backs aching before they were even old enough to plough a field. In a typical village, the well sat at the lowest natural point. That meant long walks, heavy loads, and constant exhaustion. If you lived farther uphill, you simply suffered more. Castles had it even worse. Picture a stone fortress perched proudly over a valley. From a distance, it looks invincible. But inside those walls, the greatest weakness wasn't disease, famine, or even enemy armies. It was water. If the well ran dry, if the cistern cracked, or if a siege cut off the path to the river, a castle could fall in a week. Lords, soldiers, and servants all lived with a quiet, constant fear. What happens when the water stops coming up the hill? The struggle beneath the earth. Meanwhile, miners faced another nightmare entirely. As they dug deeper, groundwater seeped in relentlessly. A single underground spring could drown a mineshaft in hours. Entire mining towns depended on boys and men who formed bucket chains, standing in a line, passing up water one bucket at a time, hour after hour. It was dangerous, exhausting work, and it wasn't enough. Many promising silver and salt mines were abandoned simply because nobody could win their daily war against rising water. Wealthy nobles begged engineers, primitive makers, craftsmen, tinkerers to find a miracle solution. But how do you push water up against gravity with nothing but wood, rope, iron, and muscle? Early attempts and failures. People tried everything. Donkeys walked in circles to pull water wheels that lifted buckets. Chains of wooden scoops rotated on crude cranks. Human treadmills powered vertical wheels that lifted water inch by inch. But these were slow, unreliable, and incredibly tiring. If the animals got sick, if the workers collapsed, or if the wheel froze in winter, the entire system fell apart. Gravity always seemed to win. Medieval society needed something better, something consistent, durable, and powerful enough to break nature's rules. And the answer wouldn't come from brute strength, it would come from genius. A new kind of thinker appears around the late 1200s. A new group of craftsmen began to rise. Proto-engineers who understood wood, leather, gears, valves, and water flow. They weren't called scientists. Most were millwrights, blacksmiths, or monks who tinkered in workshops by candlelight. But they saw something no one else saw. Water itself could be used to move water. This idea was revolutionary. If flowing rivers could turn wheels, and wheels could power mechanisms, then maybe, just maybe, nature's own force could be used to fight against gravity. It was the birth of a new age of mechanical imagination. And in secret workshops and monastery yards, a handful of medieval engineers began, assembling a strange machine made of wooden cylinders, iron rods, leather valves, and a spinning water wheel. A device so clever it could do what human arms never could. A machine that could make water climb. But how did it work? How could something so simple defy a force as absolute as gravity? That is where the mystery begins. because the next chapter reveals the invention no one expected. Chapter 2. The mystery machine, the water-raising invention no one expected. For most people in 1300 AD, machines were simple things. Grain mills, spinning wheels, bellows, carts. Tools that made life easier, yes, but nothing that seemed to flirt with the impossible. Nothing that challenged nature itself. So when rumors began to spread of a device that could push water uphill, people didn't believe it at first. They had heard of miracle springs and divine wells, but a machine that forced water to climb, that was something else entirely. Something bordering on magic. Yet hidden in workshops near rivers, in mining towns desperate for salvation, a new kind of machine was taking shape. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't elegant. But it was brilliant. It would later be called many names. The water-powered piston pump, the force pump, the rag and chain pump, the tympanum mechanism. But in its earliest days, villagers simply called it the water-raising engine. No one knew who invented the first version. Some whispered it came from Arab engineers who perfected hydraulics centuries earlier. Others claimed European. Millwrights built it by accident while experimenting with grain mills. Some believed monks discovered the principle while studying ancient Roman texts in dusty libraries. Whatever its origin, by the 1300s it was real. And it was powerful. The first sight. Shock, confusion, awe. Imagine you're a medieval villager standing near a river. You see a wooden wheel, turning steadily in the current. This isn't strange. Water wheels powered mills everywhere. But attached to this particular wheel is something unusual, an iron rod rising and falling like a giant wooden heartbeat. With each thump, you hear a deep, hollow ga-chunk. Then another, and another. A wooden cylinder on the riverbank shudders with every stroke. Inside that cylinder, hidden from view, a piston is moving up and down, sucking water from the river and forcing it into a pipe that rises toward the hill. At the top of that pipe, a trickle of water begins to emerge, then a stream, then a steady flow. To the untrained eye, it looks impossible. The river is climbing, the ingredients of genius. What made this invention so remarkable wasn't the materials. Those were simple enough. Wood, iron, leather, rope, flowing water. Every village had these things, but no village had ever combined them like this. The heart of the machine was a water wheel, turned endlessly by the river. As the wheel spun, each bump lifted a long beam, which then dropped with force. This motion drove a piston inside a wooden barrel. On the upstroke, the piston created suction, pulling water into the chamber through a leather valve. Thousands per hour. Slowly, relentlessly, the water climbed. It didn't fight gravity. It outsmarted it. This was no longer a simple machine. This was engineering. Why this mechanism was revolutionary. Before this, water could only be lifted by direct effort, human or animal muscle. But the medieval piston pump introduced a new kind of power. Indirect power, mechanical power, continuous power. As long as the river flowed, the machine worked. No food needed, no sleep, no exhaustion. For the first time, medieval people realized something profound. Some villagers were frightened. They whispered that the machine was unnatural, or that it offended God's order. Others tried to steal the design or sabotage working pumps to seize control of local water rights, a serious source of wealth and power. The engineers themselves often worked in secrecy. They hid valves under wooden covers, chained wheels behind fences, and guarded their notes like treasure. Medieval, guilds were competitive, and knowledge meant status. Yet despite the secrecy, the idea spread. Chapter 3 reveals its inner anatomy. Chapter 3. Inside the Beast, How Medieval Engineers Made Water Climb. If you could step inside a medieval workshop in 1300 AD, the first thing you'd notice is the smell. Wet wood, hot iron, oil and river water mingling together in the cool air. Tools hang from beams. Leather straps dry near the fire. A wooden wheel leans against the wall, marked with chalk lines. And in the center of the room stands a strange machine that looks more like a creature than a tool. It doesn't have eyes or a face, but it moves. It breathes. It pulses. This is the medieval water-powered piston pump from the inside. Its bones, muscles, and heart revealed. To truly appreciate the genius behind it, you have to understand not just what it did, but how every part worked together like a living body. Namkesti, the water wheel that never slept. Every pump began with a water wheel anchored in a flowing river. As long as the river moved, the wheel turned. This was the machine's heartbeat, a steady, dependable rhythm that required no command and no encouragement. Picture a wooden wheel with paddles sticking out at the rim. The river pushes these paddles, turning the wheel. Slowly at first, then faster. Every rotation sends energy up the shaft connected to the pump on the riverbank. To medieval eyes, this felt like magic. To us, it's beautifully simple. Moving water, moving wheel, moving machine. Enter the camshaft, a long wooden rod with uneven wooden bumps, cams, attached around it. As the water wheel rotated, it spun the camshaft. Every time a cam passed beneath a large wooden beam, it lifted it up, only for gravity to crash it back down. Lift, drop, lift, drop. This was the rhythm that drove the piston. To a modern engineer, this is basic mechanical translation. But to a medieval craftsman, it was a brilliant leap of imagination. They took something round and used it to create something vertical, something steady, something powerful. The muscles, the piston and cylinder. Now we reach the true heart of the mystery, the piston cylinder. Inside a hollow wooden barrel, carefully carved, polished and sealed with tar and leather, a thick wooden piston moved up and down. The fit had to be tight enough to create pressure, but smooth enough to slide. When the piston fell, the trapped water was forced upward through a pipe. This two-stroke cycle, suction and compression, inched water higher every second. People watching it work had no idea why water was moving. They only saw it obeying the machine's motion. The valves, the brain that controlled flow without valves, the pump would be nothing more than a wooden hammer hitting water. And one valve at the bottom opened only when water needed to enter the chamber. These valves had to be crafted with stunning precision. Too tight, and they wouldn't open. Too loose, and they leaked. In many villages, there were only one or two craftsmen skilled enough to make them correctly. The arteries, pipes that carried water to the summit. Once water left the piston chamber, it entered a long vertical pipe. Water was doing the one thing it was never supposed to do: rise. A symphony of simplicity and genius. None of these parts alone were extraordinary. A wheel, a beam, a piston, a valve, a pipe. But together they became a creature, one that used nature to conquer nature. But as amazing as the machine was, it didn't just look impressive on a workshop floor. Because Chapter 4 reveals how this machine transformed medieval life in ways no one expected. Chapter 4. From mines to palaces, how this machine transformed medieval life. If you want to truly understand the impact of the medieval water-raising engine, you have to leave the workshop behind and step into the world it was built for. This chapter is about that transformation. It's about miners who found hope underground, castle guards who no longer feared thirst, farmers who watched dry hills turn green, and entire towns that discovered a new kind of freedom. Let's follow the water as it climbs. Mines, where the machine became a lifesaver. Imagine descending into a medieval mine, dark, wet, cramped, lit only by flickering tallow lamps. It wasn't just exhausting, it was dangerous. If they slowed down, the water rose. And for the first time, the mine began to dry out. Many mines that had been abandoned were reopened, others pushed deeper than anyone thought possible. And in the process, Europe's supply of metals and its economy quietly transformed. It's beautiful, strong, majestic, and unbelievably impractical. Water was always the Achilles heel of high fortifications. Wells could only be dug so deep. Cisterns only held so much. During sieges, armies didn't need to breach the walls. They only needed to wait until the castle ran out of water. But suddenly, that changed. A river-powered pump at the bottom of the cliff could push water through a rising pipe all the way to the top. Slowly, steadily, hour after hour, the castle's cisterns filled. Not through desperate bucket hauls, not through risky trips outside the walls. Through a machine. It changed politics, it changed geography, all with the steady beat of a wooden piston. Farms and fields, hills that came alive before the pump. Medieval farmers avoided hillside farming unless absolutely necessary. Irrigation was nearly impossible, and carrying water uphill was backbreaking. But now, you could run a pipe from a river in the valley and let the pump do the work. Dry terraces bloomed. What used to be marginal land became valuable. Families who lived on high ground no longer trekked daily to distant springs. Crops became more reliable. Food availability improved. The pump didn't just raise water, it raised livelihoods, cities, clean water, better health, and early industry. In growing medieval towns, water was both essential and problematic. Open wells spread disease. Rivers near settlements became polluted with waste from tanners, dyers, and butchers. Clean water was precious. Mechanical pumps changed that. Urban life became just a little bit safer, all thanks to a machine that never asked for rest. A quiet revolution in plain sight by 1350. The water-raising pump wasn't a novelty. It was a necessity. It didn't glow, hum, or roar. It just worked, day after day. Chapter 5 reveals the struggles behind the genius. Chapter 5. Secrets, breakdowns, and ingenuity, the human drama behind the machine. For all its brilliance, the medieval water-raising engine was not a perfect, eternal miracle. It was a living thing, one that needed care, skill, and constant attention. When the fragile genius, why this machine was always at risk to a modern viewer, the pump might seem sturdy. Big wooden beams, thick iron rods, solid wheels. But medieval materials had limits. Wood cracked in the cold, leather dried out or tore, iron rusted, mud clogged valves, floods swept away entire wheels. The workers who kept the beast breathing. The most essential figures in this story were the millwrights, the mechanical wizards of the medieval world. These were the men who understood the rhythm of water wheels, the tension of ropes, the wear of leather, and the strange personality of each machine. But they were rare. Sometimes only one existed in an entire region. He might have learned his craft from a traveling master, or from a monastery, or from decades spent repairing grain mills and river wheels. Whatever his path, he was respected and feared. People whispered that millwrights controlled forces beyond normal understanding, and in a way, they did. A pump could fall silent in a heartbeat. Villagers would knock on the millwright's door in the dead of night, lanterns shaking, voices pleading, "Please! The water has stopped." He would arrive, kneel beside the rumbling beast and listen. Not with his ears, with his entire body. A different vibration, a wrong rhythm. But when the machine roared back to life, everyone breathed easier. Winter. The enemy that could kill a machine. Winter was the pump's deadliest foe. Rivers slowed. Castle engineers built insulated wooden boxes around the piston chambers. Monks stuffed wool around pipes to prevent the water inside from icing solid. Some rival towns tried to sabotage each other's pumps. Valves were stolen in the night. Wheels were jammed with stones. Ropes were cut. Pipes were smashed with hammers. Lords issued decrees. Monasteries negotiated treaties. There were no blueprints, no manuals, only memories, only hands-on teaching. Some fled in shame. A few were even punished by authorities when a pump failure caused economic disaster. The machine was brilliant, but it demanded loyalty, the collapse and the comeback. Every pump had moments of crisis, a flood, a breakdown, a fire, a rotten beam, a misaligned cam. When villagers thought the machine was dead, fear swept through the community. Would the mine drown? Would the castle weaken? Would the crops die on the hill? Then came the frantic repairs. Men hauling timbers, blacksmiths forging replacement rods, carpenters carving new valves, children carrying buckets of pitch to reseal pipes. Sometimes the machine stayed dead. More often, it returned stronger than before. There is something poetic about this cycle. A reminder that medieval technology was not separate from human effort. Because Chapter 6 reveals what few people know. This humble 1300 AD pump didn't just change medieval life. It changed the future of engineering forever. Chapter 6. The House That Hope Built. Dawn arrived quietly, brushing the horizon with a pale gold that washed over the tiny mud cottage like a blessing. For the first time in weeks, The family didn't wake to the sound of tools or the ache of unfinished work waiting outside. Instead, they awoke to something else entirely. Silence, soft and warm, like a sigh of relief long held inside the earth itself. The house was complete. A small, humble home of mud, straw, sweat, and hope, standing alone at the edge of the village like a stubborn little miracle. It wasn't grand. It wasn't large. A nobleman would laugh at it. A merchant might ignore it. But to the peasants who built it, this house was nothing less than freedom, carved from the ground beneath their feet. Inside, the walls were smooth and cool to the touch. The clay floor had hardened perfectly, and the smell of drying straw lingered faintly in the air. Smoke from the hearth drifted upward through the new chimney, proving that even the simplest of ideas, shaped by desperate hands, could become a triumph. The father stood in the doorway, running his calloused fingers over the wooden frame. He had shaped himself. This wasn't bought lumber. This wasn't the work of a guild carpenter. This was wood taken from the forest, trimmed with an axe that had been sharpened more times than he could remember, carved late into the night by firelight. Every groove, every notch, every uneven line was a reminder of how far he had come. The mother spread a blanket across the corner that would serve as the sleeping space. In that moment, it didn't matter that the blanket was patched or that the bed was little more than straw stuffed into a cloth sack. What mattered was that it rested inside walls they owned, or as close to ownership as a medieval peasant could ever dream of. The children chased each other around the room, each step sending soft clouds of dust drifting upward, their laughter echoing through the space. For weeks they had been helpers, carrying straw, gathering twigs, holding tools they barely understood. Later that morning, the family sat outside on the newly built bench. It was a simple, wooden plank supported by stones, but it faced the house perfectly, giving them the first chance to truly look at what they had accomplished. The walls glowed warmly in the sunlight, the golden hue of clay mixed with straw. A few came to quietly observe, as if reminding themselves what was possible when fear was set aside and effort took its place. The house wasn't just shelter, it was a declaration. A message carved into the very land. We will survive. We will endure. We will build, even when all we have is mud and hope. As the day went on, the family prepared their first meal inside. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows against the walls. The warmth wasn't simply from the flames, it was from pride, from exhaustion finally giving way to contentment. That night, as the family lay together on their straw bed, the wind whispered against the new walls. For the first time, they didn't fear it. They didn't curl together for warmth or worry about the rain creeping through the roof. The house held strong around them. The father watched the dim glow of the dying fire and thought of all the things this home did not have. It didn't have stone walls. It didn't have tiled floors. It didn't have iron hinges or glass windows. But it had something far rarer, something many in the medieval world could barely imagine. It had safety. It had dignity. It had hope. And as sleep finally pulled them under, the house that had been built with nothing but mud, straw, and courage stood guard through the night, a silent promise that even the poorest hands could shape their own tomorrow.